Our panelists today are Dr. Randall Kuna, Dr. Abulfaz Alipour, and Dr. Keith Wiley. I already introduced Dr. Kuna, but again, he's our founder and chairman for Carbon Copies, and he's known for his efforts to advance research in whole brain emulation. Dr. Alipour has his PhD in pharmacy and is pursuing a double PhD in psychology and neuroscience at Indiana University, Bloomington. In his research, he is developing new neural network architectures that are inspired by cortical column circuitry, and he is testing their predictions through large-scale in vitro neural recording. Dr. Wiley has his PhD in computer science, and he has expertise in artificial intelligence, evolutionary algorithms, various artificial intelligence techniques, and machine learning. He is also author of the book, A Taxonomy and Metaphysics of Mind Uploading, which is available on Amazon. Welcome, panelists. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thank you, Mallory. So just to add to the things you've already said, by the way, could you mute yourself? Or can everyone mute themselves when someone else is speaking, just in case? Okay, there we go. Then we don't have an echo.
There we go.
Yeah. Mallory, you're not muted at the moment. I don't know. Well, anyway, it doesn't show up as muted, but you probably have a different mute button on your headphones or something. So just to add quickly here, I don't see Abulfaz Alipour on the Hangouts yet, so I'm assuming that he hasn't logged into that. That's not a problem. He can join, and there he comes. He's joining right now. And just so you all know, there are a few other people from the Carbon Copies Foundation who are also logged into the Hangouts, and you guys, you're all welcome to directly participate as well, of course, just like our viewers who can call into that phone number or use call.carboncopies.org. I wanted to just quickly say there are a bunch of questions that came in from the audience, and we're going to try to get to as many of them as we can. Some questions can be a little bit difficult in the sense that we may not understand exactly what you meant in your question, and so we might answer it the wrong way. If you want to be sure that we get it right, that's where calling in, either using the phone number or call.carboncopies.org, is an excellent way to prevent that problem. Because, you know, if you hear us getting it wrong after you've asked us the question yourself, you can just correct us and say, no, I really meant this. Could you please answer that question? So there's a slight advantage over typing it into the live stream chat. Okay, with that, I just wanted to throw out a first question or present this to the panel. One of the things that, that we got into in that conversation is we really started talking a bit about what does it mean to have a good outcome for humans? Because when we talk about AI risk, you know, I guess the simple version is where you assume that AI becomes smart and then there's a Terminator scenario and all the humans get destroyed. That's the science fiction version of AI risk. But that's not the only outcome you could have. You can have an outcome where AI is simply going about its business and it just, you know, humanity is just this tiny little thing in the corner that doesn't have much to do with it anymore. We don't participate much in their exploration of space. They just kind of keep us alive in a zoo, you might well say, right? And then the question is this a good outcome? And people may have different views on that because, okay, humans are still alive. Our society still exists. Maybe we don't have all that optionality that Jan was talking about. But maybe if you look at it from the point of view of a whole intelligence ecosystem, instead of what are the humans doing, maybe some people still think that's good. So determining what a successful or good outcome is can be the first thing you have to do. And I'm wondering what the people on the panel think about what is a good outcome for us and why.
Am I coming through? Well, so with regard to this sort of preference to sort of protect our specialness and therefore sort of make sure that we don't get pushed into a sort of corner of obsolescence or something, you know, you could reframe that question as, what if we discovered eventually that there actually are you know, other intelligent you know, species in the universe, which is you know, a popular position. It's actually not one of my preferred positions, but if we found that was true and we found out that they were sufficiently, pretty far advanced beyond us, then we would have the exact same feeling of mediocrity. It'd be like, oh, well, okay, we're just some podunk, relatively dumb, intelligent species in a corner of the galaxy. So then the prescription would be, oh, well, to preserve our specialness, we need to somehow keep those aliens down or something. So barring the technical challenge of sort of countering some alien species that's already ahead of us, it just sort of is philosophically unconvincing. Like, why is the solution to our bruised ego to go sort of crush all the other aliens out there that have gone further than us? So then if you rephrase that, then it's like, okay, so now do we have a good motivation to try to prevent AI or sort of enhanced versions of humanity from coming into being? Does that rationale really make any sense when you look at it the way that I just phrased it?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Before I try to answer that, I was wondering if anyone else on the panel has an opinion.
No specific opinion on this particular topic.
Okay. Yeah, I'm. I try to grapple with this question as well because, of course, when we talk about whole brain emulation, we're talking about changes to that, at least optional changes that some people could choose for themselves. It could be that we all go in different directions, that some people develop in one way and others in another. And in the end, if you look at the end result, again, just like what Keith was saying, this could look just like bumping into aliens, with the only difference being that there's this common origin. And then you start wondering about things like, the rate of change. Does it matter how quickly we sort of develop into lots of different kinds of intelligences? So, all of this is hard to pin down, and it's hard for us to determine in advance, before we've thought through all these questions, what are the criteria, the parameters that we think are valuable or important about humanity and what we've accomplished, that we say this is why we should all survive. This is why either humans as they are now, biological humans, should continue to exist into the future, or at least minds that think like humans to some degree, or whatever intelligence evolves needs to be derived from the way we're thinking because of certain values that we think are really important and that we want to carry them over. Or we could just say, well, this is all way too analytical, and ultimately it's just the drive to continue to exist. And as long as we feel that whatever is happening is because we choose to do it, then it's us, and therefore, it's okay. That's success. And if whatever's happening to us is not something we've chosen, then it's not success. But as you'll see later when I talk to Anders Sandberg, that isn't quite as simple either. That when are you in control? Anyway, so that was that question. Does anyone else have a question from the panel about Jan's conversation before I bring up another one, or before we go to an audience question?
Sorry, nothing comes to mind.
Okay. Yeah, so I think we'll switch to an audience question in just a moment. I want to throw one more question out there before we do that. And the one I want to put out is, towards the end of the conversation, Jan mentioned that another issue we should look at is biologically enhanced humans, or that whole other different technology, not using computers, not uploading, but what happens if we can genetically modify to achieve whatever augmentation we want. And I'm wondering, does anyone here have an opinion about what that means, either in terms of being a risk or a benefit in itself? How does that compare to something like AGI and whole brain emulation? What do you think about this biology as the root?
So, are you referring to when he was talking about the sort of hopelessness of trying to bring horses up to competition with cars?
There was that, but then he said that, and then at the end he kind of switched back and said, well, another thing that we should really not forget about when we're looking at or trying to plan ahead for humanities, we should also look at the biological augmentation angle, because a lot of things might be achieved that way.
Well, I think my response would be the same thing that he said about the horse, which is that there are certainly, there's no particular reason to think that blind evolution has converged on some sort of biological maxima. We just are kind of whatever evolution was able to cobble together on what's called a local optima. So we're good at what we are, but in the space of all possible DNA configurations, there's very little chance that we're as good as we could be. But it's still seriously worth considering whether we believe that biology has any capacity to compete with non-biology in the long run. Right now, there are many ways in which biology is the better technology, and in that sense, I just describe biology as sort of successful nanotechnology. But once you sort of escape the sort of protein and lipid and sort of need for water, and once you kind of remove those biological variables that are incidental to what you're really trying to accomplish, but they're required at the chemistry level, then it's hard to believe that biology is really buying you anything intrinsic. Biology is just how we do it. It's how nature does it. It's how evolution does it. But there's no reason to think that it's really competitive. And we have all sorts of evidence that points that way. So our relatively simplistic 20th century computers on certain metrics just outperform biology in ways that are really there's no conversation to have about it. And I'm not convinced that won't be the pattern for everything as technology sort of scoots along eventually. I can't see an obvious counterexample where biology has to be better than just going at a problem without having a preference for a particular solution. Instead of leaning toward biology or leaning toward the full space of all possible physics and chemistry, I'm doubtful that biology is going to win very many of those races.
Yeah, and I agree with Keith because, so from the AI standpoint, I totally agree with the horse analogy of that was discussed before, and I think it would be somehow meaningless sometimes to think it like that as a method to catch up with AI. But from another perspective, if you think of non-destructive whole brain emulation, you would eventually need some sort of a brain-computer interface or some sort of a neuroprosthetic to transfer information from biological brains to some artificial medium. And I think from that perspective, BCI neuroprosthetic is extremely important. But from arguing for advancement of BCI and calling for more attention to BCI or neuroprosthetics, because in order to catch up with AI, I think that would be a little bit improbable or implausible, at least.
Okay, yeah, I think those are all really good points, and yes, Keith, as you mentioned, I think you're right. What Jan was basically alluding to was the idea that you can look at biology as getting to the point of what you might accomplish with some nanotechnology. In a sense, it is nanotechnology. But yes, as you both pointed out as well, there are limitations to that. So I noticed that I've sort of taken on the kind of moderator role in this bit of the panel. I'm sorry about that, Mallory. You can always jump in and do that if you want to.
All right. Are we going to be moving to audience questions now? Okay. So the first audience question that we're going to ask is from Leslie Seymour. He asks, Skype moved voice and multimedia communication from conventional POTS to open protocol scalable internet with firewalls and similar security architecture constructs. Do you see any similar changes, at least at the metaphoric level, when the internet payload content reaches the wet brain directly? Could somebody maybe rephrase that question, or can answer to that, or has knowledge pertaining to that question?
I can try, but I'd love to let someone else have a first go at it.
I'm still thinking, and I spoke first last time. You go.
Abul Fazl, how about you?
So if I understand this correctly, the question is, what would happen if you are able to connect so in a super simplistic way, and correct me if I'm wrong, it would be, what would happen if you're able to connect a search engine into your brain? And do you agree that that would be a simplified version of this question?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. This is where, as I said, if
Okay.
people asking questions were on our call line, it would make it easy for them to clarify.
Yeah.
A little easier than typing into the chat there.
I'm sorry.
So
I'm curious.
maybe you're right.
If Leslie.
Yeah.
I'm curious if Leslie is asking about. Sorry.
Oh yeah, sure. Go ahead, Keith. Sorry.
I'm curious if he's asking about the benefits of sort of open source or open standards as opposed to walled garden approaches to security. I completely forgot what the acronym POTS stands for. I'm trying to just read that. At any rate, I certainly think that there is, in most cases, security is better served by open standards that embody secure algorithms, sort of like the way public encryption works, as opposed to security that is achieved by trying to make sure that. Oh, thank you, Rose, for decrypting that algorithm, that acronym. As opposed to security that basically depends on making sure that that no one even knows how your security works, and that is the method of security. That's an inherently weak form of security. So, one thing that we definitely have to take very seriously as technology becomes ever increasingly incorporated into our brains is we've really got to get security right in a way that we have clearly completely failed at in the last 30 to 50 years. When I was in graduate school, one of the professors who I was inspired by in terms of artificial life, one of the people who sort of drew me to the school I chose was David Ackley. And he was interested in computer security, and he had, since he was one of the pioneers of artificial life, his approach to it was very sort of evolutionarily inspired. And he and Stephanie Forrest and others at the University of New Mexico took an approach to computer security that was intentionally inspired by biological immune systems. And I think we have seen some of these analogies crop up in our sort of attempts to build these sort of auto-adaptive, sort of self-monitoring, on-the-fly security systems. We do sort of try to do some of this in the modern era, but I'm not sure if we have a very refined sort of underlying philosophy for how we do it. But just to get back to the original question, I think that as this becomes increasingly incorporated into our bodies, it will just become that much more serious, just because it'll put lives more directly at risk. We're already concerned about hacking, pacemakers and Parkinson's brain implants, and this is just going to become more and more serious as time goes on.
And just to add to that, so imagining that the question was, what would happen if you have brain implants, and what would you do to secure the communication in these brain implants? So I was actually, when you talk to people about brain implants, one of the common concerns is that how would you secure that brain implant? How would you make sure that someone cannot upload some virus or some bad software into my brain implant, or someone could basically hijack my brain implants? And I think possible approaches to this challenge might be to use, so one possible idea would be to use some sort of a distributed ledger technology that is currently developing for Internet of Things devices, and one other approach would be to use quantum switch. But the way I think about it, I think at the moment, one possible viable option to secure communication in brain implants would be to use some sort of a distributed ledger technology. That's what I think about it.
Okay. It looks like the person who asked the question, Leslie Seymour, is actually trying to call in at this time. So maybe he's going to be able to clarify his question in person, which would be very useful.
Yeah.
I'm not sure he's ready yet, but we'll see in just a moment.
So a simplified model would be that we have a brain implant or something, some neuro dust or something. So you got some sort of the infrastructure, and so the question is, there are two questions. One is how to protect it from direct interference, just like when you have a cell phone, right? You make sure that no one is listening, no one can inject any information as the wireless signal goes up. Now in this case, it's not a wireless, maybe a wireless signal, but the signal is basically translated from neural signals, internal neural signals. And at the infrastructure side, there will be an agent, I would assume, which represents you as a person, and that agent is intercepting your brain to infrastructure communication. So that brings up basically two major questions. One is how to protect the pipe between your brain and the agent, and in the cloud or whatever they are going to have at that time. And the other question is how the agents of different people communicate to one another. So what would be, so it seems to me that just following the paradigm that the telecommunication industry is following, all of these protocols are standardized, or I would expect that when it becomes reality, there will be a standardization effort. And really how secure your brain will be, it's basically will depend on the quality of the protocol and the firewalls in between those agents. And if there are any central servers where all the agents are talking to, how that central server is protected, or something equivalent, some blockchain or something that's going to replace the central server. So basically the question was kind of poking other people's ideas that what kind of systems architecture arrangements with some vision. I didn't see any of these issues being addressed, not even in the list of question level, in the futuristic communities that investigate the merger of AI and web brain. So basically that was the intention. If anyone has any kind of vision that what would be the roadmap and how the whole architecture would be regulated by the industry, similarly to all the telecommunications standard bodies that operate today with a conventional and IP-based communication.
Okay. So Leslie, I hope you can hear me as I'm responding. I don't know how the sound is going back with Alan's trick, if you hear it straight through.
How much of it was transmitted and understood?
You came through fine on my end anyway. Some people are saying that they heard a lot of echo, but I didn't hear that. So maybe this is.
Hello? Hello?
I'm hearing you fine. Can you hear me?
Hello?
I think that Leslie. I don't know how the sound goes back to the Uber conference, Alan. If that's
he should be able to hear you directly, so we can talk to him, and you can.
So you don't need to. He doesn't need to turn on the live stream or something to be able to hear me, right?
No, he should be able to hear you. So I don't know why not, but it came through well. So if you want to ask a question.
In any case, I will try to address the question. So you're right, Leslie, that the question of safety for the communication protocol when you build a BCI, or the safety of a whole brain emulation in an ecosystem of AI, that problem was not addressed clearly, at least so far in this workshop. And it also, to my knowledge, hasn't been addressed very clearly or explicitly by most of the talking points or the writing that's come out of the AI safety community. And I think that's partly because they sort of constrain themselves to the problem of what to do about the intelligence of the AI and the possible dangerous runaway scenarios of that. Whereas this other problem, you can kind of set that aside and say, well, this is a problem for the encryption community, because this is all about data paths and encrypting that and about not letting people hack your brain. It's easy to dismiss it, and I don't think it should be dismissed, because it's clearly not simple. All of our systems today are pretty, hackable. Hardly any of them are foolproof. So I can only say that, in my own background, I did some encryption stuff because, information theory, you learn about that sort of thing to some degree. And back then, the professors were all saying, well, even though our systems are not foolproof today, in theory, you could make them all pretty unhackable. And now add on top of that blockchain, which didn't exist back then, maybe that would make it even better. I'm not sure, because at this point, I'm no longer, I couldn't call myself an expert in that area. All I know is that it's definitely an issue because currently everything seems pretty hackable, or a lot of things do. And that's going to make a big difference to how secure people feel, in the sense that, okay, I want to connect myself to this machine out there, to these other agents, or I want to have my brain emulated and be an upload. And these agents, again, how those agents represent us and how they communicate, and whether those could be faked and other things like that. This is additional problems and hurdles you could have there. It sounds to me like just the general problem that people try to hack and misuse every technology out there. And in the future, it might not just be people trying to do that. It could be other intelligences, other AI, trying to do the same thing too, trying to use it to their purposes. So every little point needs to be, be analyzed in that sense. And maybe this is why going to open standards is, where you end up, because then you have the most people paying attention to at least one protocol and trying to get it right, instead of lots of people having their own little thing and each of them being very breakable, not getting enough attention, discovering all the holes. So I think something that standardizes is probably, it's what you would typically see. So in that sense, wrapping all the way around, my answer to your question would be, yeah, I think it would probably go in a similar direction that way. I don't know if this answers your question, because it is a complicated question. It's not really in my domain. But that was my attempt. If anyone else wants to make an attempt, please go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, I just want to say that I agree with Randall, and yeah, nothing is 100% foolproof, unhackable, and yeah, there's always a concern, and it would be much better if we have a system that defines a standard and everyone is using that. That would be much more helpful. Yeah, I'm looking forward to hear what you think, Keith. Yeah.
Right. Well, we're sort of mirroring each other. I would just reiterate, it has been. I think it even was mentioned. I think Leslie mentioned it that in theory there are notions of quantum security. There are notions of security in which even if you can't prevent someone from breaking in or listening in, you can make it possible to detect that it has occurred. Even if you can't prevent someone from breaking in without also breaking your own channel, you can make it so that if someone breaks in, the whole thing collapses so that at least, again, they don't succeed, and then you can rebuild afterwards. There are all sorts of approaches. We have all become sort of jaded in the last decade or two. Every time someone says that they've got a new approach to security that's going to solve all the problems, we learn that that's not true. I think quantum mechanics is trying to bring a whole new level of confidence to that discussion, but for my part, I've just kind of lost confidence in the whole thing, which is why I go back to what I said earlier. The research that was being done sort of around my graduate department, although not directly by me, was to sort of accept that security is not a perfect thing, just the way your body's security is not a perfect thing. You are subject to viral and bacterial and parasitic attacks all the time. And evolution's solution was not to ever attempt to evolve the sort of metaphor of an ironclad wall. Instead, it detects and responds and reacts and fights back and just sort of does its best. And the truth is, it doesn't always work. Things that attack biology sometimes get through and kill you in various ways, but that is what the system attempts to do. It just attempts to detect, adapt, and fight. And I think that ultimately the right approach to security is to be adaptive. And we're just going to have to make our computers, and especially our computer bio interfaces and everything like that, we're going to have to abandon this idea of a mathematically perfect system, and that'll be very hard for society in general to come to terms with, because we need our bank accounts to be, not some sort of computer version of.
I think we might have lost Keith there.
Yeah, that's too bad. But it gives me
Go
an
ahead.
opportunity. Oh,
I
there he
think
is.
he's back. Yep.
Yeah. No,
Sorry, Keith, we lost you for a second. Maybe you want to repeat what you said the last half minute or so.
Oh, well, I was wandering around aimlessly anyway. But yeah, I was just wrapping up that we really do have to accept the idea of these computerized immune systems that detect, adapt, and fight, and sometimes lose, but that the war wages on even if the occasional battle is lost, and that is our overarching philosophy to computer security. And I don't think we're there yet. I don't think our society is ready for that. I was saying I don't.
Yeah, I want to quickly latch onto that.
Entities is going to allow us to do that.
So first of all,
yeah.
Sorry, I wanted to say, Keith, that answer was probably the most lucid answer of the lot, and thank you very much for saying all this. I wanted to latch onto it because when you mentioned, you have to come to terms with the fact that nothing is going to be a perfect solution for security, and you sort of have to learn to live with that, but society may not be ready for it. Suddenly, on a meta level, I'm seeing this as something we may encounter with the whole AI security or AI safety issue, which is that the attempt to analytically figure out AI safety, which is really what the FHI, the FLI, MIRI, and others are trying to do, is an analytic approach to how do we accomplish AI safety. it may be that ultimately we'll discover that it's always going to be the same thing as this immune system approach, where there is no perfect solution. It doesn't constantly work. And you may just have to come to terms with that, just like in security and communication. So maybe this applies to the bigger topic as well.
Okay, I think that kind of concludes the answers for that questions, unless there was anyone that wanted to add anything else on our panel. Doesn't sound like it, so I'll move on to the next question. This is from Ree Rose. She asks, BCI technology could be very positive and enhancing. How do we prevent potential malicious usage and unintentional consequences? And I think that kind of wraps back around to what we were just discussing. She goes on to say, you know, for example, control of a person's mood, voting, consumer preferences, etc. But I'd also like to add, what about indirect control, such as when we have the kind of controversy we have right now with people's data being available and that being used for marketing campaigns and targeting people specifically, directly for certain things. If that's going to be an issue once we're able to upload our brains, and you know, there's some way that that could be accessible. And I also just wanted to mention, I am incorrect about us taking our break. We're actually going to be taking our break at 1:45 and then coming back at 2 p.m. Pacific time.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that correction. I'll take a quick first stab at this. And yeah, thanks for broadening this from just looking at how do you make sure that there's no malicious, say, signals going into the brain, or that your signals are being misrepresented outward. But even what Mallory was saying, you know, how about control of a person's mood? This is actually part of Rose's question too. How about control of a person's mood and that sort of thing? And I think it's very closely related to Leslie's question, in the sense that ultimately it's a security problem. It's a matter of who, you know, what are the rights that we bestow, first of all, when we have these systems? You know, like when we started messing around with DNA, there was the same sort of question. What are the laws going to be about this? How can you use someone's DNA? Are you allowed to use a person's DNA without their explicit consent? And if they give their consent, do they really know what they're giving consent to? Similarly, when you talk about brain-computer interfaces, you're going to want to have informed users, and the person using it is going to have to have you know, a fairly good understanding of the security that they've got coming along with that, and that security has to be pretty good, very good, in fact. But in addition to that, there are all these indirect ways that you know, that people might find that there is some control seeping in from elsewhere that they wouldn't want. You know, if you can give somebody images directly into the brain, for instance, if you can put them into a virtual reality of sorts, there's the potential that that virtual reality can be shaped by those who create those programs, and that can influence what a person thinks, and it can be very subtle. Now, the same sort of thing, of course, is happening today with advertising and you know, political campaigns and all the rest, and the whole concept of fake news and all of this. So it's not a completely new question. It just becomes more pressing when you're so much more directly connected. And so it's not just the question of security and protocols. It's also a question of having laws that people, and agreements they have to make, and education, understanding what those agreements actually mean, and what you can think that you are, how secure you are and how secure you aren't. So this happens today, even on the internet. People don't realize how easy it is to fall for something. Say you receive an email, what happens if I click on this link? So the informed user is the safer user. So education is going to be an important part. I know this doesn't sound like a perfectly technical solution to everything. A lot of it's kind of messy and requires bringing a lot of people up to speed and all of that. But I think that's exactly how it's going to be. It's going to be a bit messy. And the only good thing about this, assuming that not everything goes boom, is that hopefully we won't have to adapt to everything all at once. Hopefully it's a stepwise process. First, some people are going to get say, an artificial retina, or if they're a locked-in patient, they'll have some way of controlling, their new robotic exoskeleton, something like that. And those are some fairly limited paths through which communication happens, and you can figure out how to safeguard that and explain to the user how to use it. And then we become used to those sorts of things, and then it moves to the next level where maybe people have brain-to-brain communication of a kind, and first it's a thin channel, and there are ways to secure that, and then that becomes a broader channel where more is possible, and they've already learned to live with it to a degree. So hopefully this gradual and iterative process allows for the the learning that we all have to do to make it happen. Anyway, I'll leave this to someone else now.
I just wanted to add to what you said, and I think there are interesting, promising technologies on the horizon. As I talked about before, a little bit about the distributed ledger technology. So, for example, blockchain is an example that is immutable. You cannot change it. So I believe that in the coming years, with the advent of Web 3.0, with the Internet of Things taking over and becoming more and more prevalent, I think there might be technical solutions for these concerns and these problems that not 100%, but to a good extent, they're covering all these different issues that we're dealing with. For example, controlling someone's mood or voting and consumer preference, and all these different hot topics that we have to consider when we want to think about neuroprosthetics. For example, imagine that I have a neuroprosthetic that is for depression, for people who have depression, and then what happens if someone can hack into that, and instead of making someone better, just worsen their condition? So how would we secure that? I think one technical answer to that would be to look into the common technologies like something like Hashgraph or IOTA's Tangle technology, the DAC technology that is coming. And I think that might provide interesting solutions to deal with these problems. Yeah.
That's, I totally agree that there are probably a lot of new solutions coming down the pipeline. But I'd like to caution that, just because something seems hot right now, since it hasn't been used much yet, we don't really know what all of its holes are, and some of them can be insidious. So take, for example, what you just said about, the person who's receiving treatment for depression.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's assume that there are 20 million people in the world who are receiving the same treatment, and there's a company that's providing this. Now, the company, therefore, has probably got some data about how often each of these people are receiving their treatment. And the user may have signed an agreement where they said that the company is allowed to use this data to improve their services or something like that. And they interpret that to mean that they can use that to improve services to these people, but not just for their treatment, but also to sell it to advertisers to send them stuff that's good for people with depression. So again, you've created a loophole here where, some unexpected things might start to happen. You might suddenly notice that all of the, advertisements that are popping up for you, they're all based around depression, but they might even be subtle advertisements where they're not directly about depression. They're just advertising things that typically appeal to someone who happens to be going through depression at certain times of the day. And strange stuff like that. So it can be very hard to locate all of the problems in advance. That's where I think the analytical approach fails, and it has to be this iterative learning approach for how do we really safeguard what we're going through right now.
Yes, that's correct. I totally agree with that.
Okay, it sounds like we're done with that question. The next question that I have is from Alexei Potapov. I don't think I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he asks, why are we so concerned about AI threats while staying in the body is 100% fatal? Should we better discuss whole brain emulation in a context of mind uploading or evidence-based cryonics? And I think maybe what he's asking is, why are we so concerned with artificial intelligence safety when there are still issues to be solved with mortality. I'm not sure if I'm interpreting that correctly or not.
Well, hopefully we're interpreting it correctly, but
Yeah.
he could of course call in to call.carboncopies.org if he wants to
Or
elucidate further.
if you'd like to clarify on the YouTube channel, we can also look at that.
So,
yeah.
I mean, there's one obvious way in which the question of AI threats is relevant, even though biology is sort of the guaranteed death we're all sort of thinking about solving, although it's not necessarily my primary motive in mind uploading. But the obvious response is that people, how do I phrase it? Everyone's concerned that AI might end not only your life but end humanity. So if it's a choice between letting humanity continue to hobble along for a few more centuries while we slowly figure this out, and accidentally, creating some existential, sort of, eliminative event, then clearly the choice would be, okay, let's not go straight at AI now, even though it's tempting. Let's just, keep hobbling along with our 100-year lifespans or 60-year lifespans or whatever, and let our technology get to the point where we can do AI without wiping humanity out. I think that's the obvious sort of go-to response there.
Yeah, I would agree with that obvious response. And just to sort of emphasize the second part of his question, shouldn't we be discussing whole brain emulation in the context of mind uploading or evidence-based cryonics? Yes, of course. And that's what we normally do. Say, for instance, in our previous workshops, that's exactly what we did. We talk about the technology to get to mind uploading, which is, whole brain emulation of one sort or another, and the different paths that go there. We've talked about ways to work with preserved brains and how to get to whole brain emulation. And then we've expanded that to look at a few other topics as well. So I don't know if you were there when I was giving my opening remarks, and I pointed out that this is a big puzzle, and we keep adding in more pieces, and our workshops are trying to address a whole bunch of them eventually. So now we're trying to address this overlap area where AI safety and whole brain emulation may interact. And that's an acknowledgement of the fact that, yes, we personally may be, we may really care about whole brain emulation as a technology, either because we think it's super important for individual people, or we think it's super important for, humanity as a whole. But we have to acknowledge that you're not working in a vacuum. If we create whole brain emulation, if we're doing the research towards whole brain emulation, the things that happen because we're doing that work may interact with the other things that are happening around us, say in the world of AI development and where that goes. And that altogether can have an effect on where we all end up. So the outcome isn't just dependent on our thinking about mind uploading and cryonics. So I think that's why we're trying to, find these corner situations, these tangential things, these places where domains overlap, and to think about that as well.
And from another perspective, I think it's still important to think about AI threats. So let's, in an imaginary scenario, let's imagine that we have the first whole brain emulation, and that one becomes an AI threat by itself, and it takes over, and it makes it impossible for everyone else to perform the whole brain emulation. And so it wipes out the entire humanity, and that would be the only thing that exists on the planet. So I think still it's really important to consider AI threats, especially when it comes to whole brain emulation. What happens, and I think this is one of the 4 topics of this workshop as well, that whole brain emulation itself would be a runaway AI. And I think from that perspective, it is really important to consider this AI threat topic in whole brain emulation. Yeah.
All right, I think we'll move on to the next question. So let's see. I believe we will do the question from Roman Sitalu. Is whole brain emulation necessary for mind uploading? Could a far simpler model be sufficient to simulate the human mind of a particular person? And I also, just to keep it kind of in the context of our workshop, I'm curious to know if this simpler model would be generated by AI algorithms instead of necessarily completely doing a one-to-one copy of the biological brain.
That's a great way to put an extra spin on it. I'm going to jump in right away because it so happens that there was a part of the upcoming interview with Andrew Sandberg that got into this. And this is because, of course, you can make a distinction between a simulation of a person's brain or mind and an emulation, where the distinction we'd make is a simulation is something that to the outside looks like perhaps this is a person reacting the way they should be reacting. But on the inside, perhaps it's really not all the same. There isn't really the same person behind it. It could be more of an actor, you know. And that's precisely where Anders, for instance, pointed out, well, our systems are best when they understand us best. So we can see with a cell phone, for example, that it works better when the interface kind of understands where we're coming from. When, let's say, Siri learns something about us or whatever, or Google learns what our likes and dislikes are, and then they can go out and find the things we enjoy. They become our agents, looking for the answers we want to find, or the things we want to buy, and so forth. Now, as you get better and better at that, if you have an AI that keeps on making better predictions of you, at some point, that AI could go out there as an agent and basically pretend to be you and go shop for the right things, invest your money the way you would be doing it, talk to your kids to make sure they feel like you're paying attention to them and all that sort of thing. And it gets to a point where you could say, yeah, there's a pretty good simulation of that person there. But the question is that simulation the same as an emulation? Is something that can pretend to be you and other people won't notice it's not? Is that close enough? Is that good enough? Is that what you're going for? And that wraps right back around to, I guess, what is always the fundamental question that we bring up whenever we talk about whole brain emulation and research towards it, which is, what are the success criteria? What do we mean by mind uploading and whole brain emulation? What is it we want to accomplish? Do we want to make agents that can pretend to be us online? Is that the main purpose? Do we want to create something that can improve us, ourselves, where we have the ability to say, think faster, notice things at a microsecond split interval and react to those things? Do we want to be able to live longer ourselves by being, able to emulate our brains and run as a mind upload in another body, have an artificial brain, as it were, whether you decide to do this by replacing bits one at a time or do a scan the whole preserved brain, or which approach you want to use. So part of the question is always, why is someone interested in it? What is the success criterion they're going for? And so this part of this is reaching a consensus. What do those of us working on it really think the success criteria should be? What are we aiming for? And some of it is perhaps, something you can derive more analytically, where you can say, well, if people are interested in mind uploading, it really only makes sense to go after this if we at least care about X. Otherwise we could just make any old AI or something like that. So there are reasons why we would. Oh, sorry, somebody wants to go on. Okay, I'll finish my thought. I don't know. Okay, next person.
We actually have Roman on the Uber conference line. I think he's going to discuss his question. So we're going to have Roman on now. Oh, actually, he just said his question was answered correctly, so that's great. Is there anyone else that was wanting to add any thoughts to that question?
Yeah, I just wanted okay, go Keith, go ahead.
I'm not sure if I had anything around the safety angle that we're trying to put on it. Randall's very good at phrasing the underlying question here of what's the criteria we want. There are a couple ways in which I've seen this sort of issue come up. There's always the question of philosophical zombies, this notion that if you emulate Well, no, actually, that's not the. So philosophical zombies are just if you, no matter what level you emulate, have you actually sort of achieved the goal of identity of consciousness, sort of reinvigoration in some metaphysical sense. Of course, the best way to just sort of respond to that quickly is nobody knows, and let's just move on for the time being. Now there is this other question, and there are companies that have done this. I can't remember if Randall touched on this. There have been companies around for several years now that are sort of trying to get a foot in the door with this sort of what would you call it? Sort of mind archival. They don't even call it that, but just this notion of let's capture as rigorous a snapshot of a person's sort of life as possible, and see if we can turn that into something that we would call an imperfectly preserved mind and identity. There have been multiple approaches to this. I can't remember where I read this article. There was some guy who he was a journalist, and he interacted with a company that was doing this, and their goal was to basically they would do several things. They would run interviews with you and try to sort of compile this sort of chatbot like. They would try to refine a chatbot that responded, increasingly like the person does in an interview. They would scrape your social media profiles to try, or websites, or anything available to try to build as complete a picture as possible of the person. And you can sort of see where this is all going. And then, the larger question is there a fundamental error in the assumption that this is all predicated on? Thank you, Leslie. I see that in the chat, the replica chatbot with a K. Mindfile, Jan. Yes, I remember that name. See, I've been loosely...
Yeah, that's the TerraSem movement, right?
I've been aware of these projects for so long, I've forgotten them now. So we're all, okay, so it sounds like we're all aware of this together. So yes, there are people who have asked the question of whether, you can achieve something like mind and identity preservation, and then the secondary question of whether you can actually achieve any consciousness preservation with these very high level kind of black box approaches to what personhood means. You basically take a Turing test approach to the whole thing, which is that a person is just what you can get in and out through the I/O interfaces of the system. So basically, what can you put into it through its eyes, and what can you get out of it through its mouth? And if the patterns are sufficiently like the person, then did we achieve our goal or not? And I'm going to safely say I don't know. But we've been trying to figure this out for a while now. I kind of go over this some in my book, but Randall and I have kicked around the idea of at what level do you perform your system identification, is the term that Randall may be very familiar with. At what level do you cut your system identification cutoff at, and say, if we don't, system identify at this low level, whatever our threshold we choose, then we just say, it's just not good enough. How do we set that threshold if you're really achieving the same behavior eventually? So I don't have an answer to that, but it's definitely a question that people have been thinking about for a while, because that's kind of all I have to say on that.
That was an excellent answer that went into a lot of detail. Yeah, exactly. It's about, what is the good, the level of separation between what you would call a successful upload, having captured what you care about, and all the stuff underneath. Yeah, perfectly said.
Yeah, and just going off of what Keith said, and I think so, yes, we all want to have the simplest program that can preserve the identity of a person. And so one of the things that we need is, as Keith just mentioned, is consciousness. So what is the simplest thing that you can do to preserve consciousness? And that goes back to this idea of scale separation. So should I be able to simulate or emulate all the ionic channels, or should I be able to simulate all the neurons or the brain regions, or at what scale and then at what level I can stop and then say, okay, this is enough to recreate that consciousness or recreate that mental experience, that phenomenal experience. So, and I think we don't know yet, but many neuroscientists may say it's just at the neuronal level. You need to emulate your system, your artificial brain at the neural level, to be able to recreate that consciousness and preserve the personal identity. But we don't know yet. That's a great question, but we don't. No one knows yet.
All right. Is there anyone that wants to add anything else to that question? I don't think so. So our next question comes from Vitaly. I believe this is actually a question that we've kind of addressed before in previous workshops. He asks, how detailed is the emulation of electrochemical processes you intend to use? Subthreshold dendritic potentials, are they taken into account? Are features of spines taken into account? What approaches are used to emulate chemical synapses and neurotransmitters? And one thing that I'd kind of like to add to that, will we use, as we experiment with whole brain emulation and with going down to different levels of detail, as Vitaly asks in his question, are the insights that we gain from that information going to help with developing artificial intelligence?
Hi, sorry, I lost it there, so I missed a bit, but I got your question.
Okay.
Very nice. Towards AI. The way I get to this next part where the panel discussion.
I think you're having some connection issues, Randall.
Time is sort of, we should people who are joining now because they want to see that. Me?
Yeah,
okay.
Randall, I'm not sure if it's you, but try again, Randall.
It's me. Because I lost connector.
Randall, while you're figuring that out, could you mute yourself and maybe we'll have Abulfaz or Keith try to answer that question?
Let's see. I was definitely thinking Randall was the guy for it. Let's see. So the question is, at what neural level do we want to attempt these brain emulations? And of course, no one has decided yet. One of the most popular answers to that question, one that I personally favor, is to take that sort of input-output function I was describing earlier at the action potential level of neurons, which is to say that when you ask about dendritic spines and such in your question, I am, with reservation, actually writing off that requirement. I'm proposing that maybe the better level is the one at which you build a system that can propagate signals through a network in a pattern that is similar to the way that a brain propagates action potentials through a neuron connected network. So whether or not the synapses actually have the exact same properties would be irrelevant so long as the action potentials do actually get through in a statistically similar fashion. That's not to say that that's the right level. It's just one of the more popular levels to go to. I actually personally believe that can't possibly be the level we have to go to, because when people lose neurons from a variety of medical maladies, at least at a low level, it seems to have very little effect on our health and our personality. You can lose a couple of neurons here and there, and it doesn't make any difference. I personally suspect that something along the lines of cortical columns or other conglomerations of neurons, that we would have to decide what our grouping criteria is, but some sort of unit of groups of neurons that performs a function, and this might be as large as thousands of neurons, like cortical columns, is probably sort of the Lego brick we're looking for in all of this. But again, I don't really put a flag in the sand very deeply on any of this. We don't know. There are, of course, I'll let somebody else speak in a second, but just to quickly There are definitely people who propose much lower levels. Hameroff and Penrose are well known for proposing, the microtubule structures inside of neurons, as a critical component of, certainly of consciousness, and then of course, presumably of identity preservation and everything else we're trying to get at. People have taken this as an interpretation that they're against technologies like mind uploading and such, and I believe that they've been cornered in the occasional interview on this and have actually said, no. We're okay with it all, but you do have to take into account, this quantum mechanical requirement that we, Penrose and Hameroff, are stipulating. So many of us are not actually on board with that requirement, but it just says the same thing. It says, okay, well, there is this level of perfection, sort of inside of atoms that you've got to replicate, or else we're gonna, not say that the process has been successful. So you can make this decision at several levels of abstraction, and surely the right answer at this time in history is we don't know yet.
And yet, just talking about Penrose and Hameroff's orchestrated objective reduction theory, OR, and the whole bunch of other quantum mind theories out there, I think, so these theories are really interesting, getting consciousness to the molecular level. However, at the time being, these theories have not been able to show a mechanistic description of how this quantum effect or quantum phenomena happens that can give rise to consciousness. For example, Penrose and Hameroff idea had a real big pushback from the neuroscience community about their validity and how it could work in the brain given its temperature and noisiness and all the other criteria, the other conditions that exist in the brain. And I think, as you mentioned, probably at the neuronal level or at the circuit level, we would find a good enough information so that we could be able to somehow recreate the mental phenomena on an artificial medium.
Okay, since we did say we are going to do Anders' interview at 1:30 Pacific, we're going to go ahead and skip our break and end the panel for now, but we will address any further questions from the audience members in Q&A sections later.